it all together into a book to really frame up what I consider to be a fundamental change in the evolution of leadership. It's really like a change that probably only happens every 2,000 years. We're talking about a major change.
Okay, so welcome everyone to WorkPod podcast. Today we have with us Jeffrey Hull. He's a resident expert when it comes to understanding the nuances and the criticality of leadership. And today we will have a ball. We will be learning about how and what and all the five W's and H about leadership. And if you're curious, this would be an interesting conversation to be part of. With that, Jeffrey, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So, I'm curious. So, walk us through the journey of why coming to the world of leadership. Walk us through your past leading to the present.
Well, I think it can be divided up into three quick segments. Each of us has like a career journey that's very convoluted and, nuanced, but mine can probably be summarized into three parts. Number one, I graduated from college with a bachelor's degree in liberal arts, philosophy, music, which didn't translate into anything very practical, but curiosity and interest in a lot of subjects ultimately led me to work in HR for quite a few years. And working in HR for Booz Allen and Hamilton, one of the large consulting firms, I had an opportunity to get involved with coaching and counseling and mentoring programs. And those are the kinds of things that I really enjoyed. So at a certain point in my career, I decided to jump off and go into the entrepreneurial venture. So the second phase of my career was starting with a partner leadership development consulting firm in New York, focused on Wall Street firms, financial companies, software companies, pharmaceuticals, and we did a lot of leadership trainings and retreats and all of those kinds of activities, customized leadership. During that, I realized that coaching was a really important component of developing a successful leader. And then I also realized that since I did not have a psychology background, I didn't have a lot of deep underpinnings to know how to do that effectively. So I went back to school and got a PhD in psychology, clinical psychology, and the rest is history. I mean, the next phase of my career, which continues, started to involve teaching, writing, coaching executives, and basically focusing on the evolution of leadership, as I said, and working with as many different executives in different industries as possible all over the world, which is incredibly, you never get bored because it's never the same thing twice.
That's pretty interesting. So, I'm curious to know your perspective. How much of leadership is science vis-a-vis arts? Like how much of the very aspect of being a great leader is scientific vis-a-vis an arts project? I'm curious.
I love that question because you're getting at the subtitle of my book, right? Which is the art and science of leadership in a changing world. And it's really, it's at the intersection of art and science where the best leadership emerges. And I say that because there is really good data, evidence-based research on what it takes for human beings to perform at their best, which didn't really exist until the last 10 or so years. Research around emotional intelligence, research around how the brain works, the neuroscience of effectiveness, of performance, research around fitness, physical fitness, and how the somatic energy of the human being is really important, taking care of ourselves, sleep, nutrition, all the things that we now know. But it impacts communication, it impacts collaboration. So there's a scientific underpinning to being effective in the world as a leader or as a part of a organization. And then when you all go to apply all that research, human beings are complex. Human beings are not as simple as the data that you might amass about, the underpinnings would tell you. That in the real world, it's much more complicated and complex and nuanced. And so there's an art to applying the science, especially in today's world where things are disrupted. We have pandemics, we have ecological issues, we have competition, we have social equity problems. We have so many things that leaders have to grapple with. So they need both. They need good, solid scientific underpinnings so that they know that they're on the right track. But they also need to have a good sense of self-awareness, and they know their own intuitive ways of being. And they need to get good feedback from coaches, from colleagues, from the world to tell them what's working and what isn't working. So I really do believe that effective leadership today is an art, as you said, but it's grounded in science.
That is interesting. So I was I think last week. So leadership has not changed for when it comes to the very idea of leading, right? So we have been leaders. There have been. So it was funny. Like we were watching one of the. So I'm from India. So there were like a lot of cultural things, a lot of religious things about Indian heritage and culture and whatever. So hundreds of years back, there was a guy called Chanakya, and he was very sort of very good strategic thinker when it comes to sort of organizing things. And I was watching this and watching that playbook or the book that was scripted for whatever he or she he did. It was fascinating to see how much that is applicable even today, right? And then we realized many of the religious scriptures, many of them have amazing ways out to whatever our leadership challenges today are, right? So from your vantage point, how much of the very aspect of being a good leader has evolved? Because I think it's comical to sometimes think that even the scriptures that were written like couple of hundreds or thousands of years back somehow still holds, like, so we as a human, or our Maslow's hierarchy or whatever we call it, hasn't changed that much. We are still very much predictable in when it comes to what wrongs or what rights we are doing. What I wonder, have you given a thought on this?
Oh, yeah. I think that the fundamental cultural underpinnings of leadership haven't really changed a lot for thousands of years. And that is why what I'm writing about and some others are writing about, I'm not the only one, is such a fundamental revolutionary shift, because there's now a whole different frame of reference from hierarchy, patriarchy, pyramids. Power dynamics have changed. The information age is such that we now have people that are networked and connected all over the world. So, even in institutions or governments where they still cling to like an authoritarian type of cultural leadership dynamic or narrative, but even in those environments, there are people that are constantly chipping away because they have access to information. The technology that's available through the internet and through other means is creating this flattening effect. And also, the amount of diversity is shifting the emphasis from being a very male, masculine dominated energetic to being a more multicultural and a lot more feminine. And you could say that it's male or female. I actually don't make that distinction. I think of it more as masculine versus feminine and the integration of the two. And these are huge shifts. If you think about flattening, if you think about democratizing through information, whether it's allowed by the institutions or not, it's still happening. If you think about networked organizational dynamics that are more community-based rather than hierarchical, if you think of the pace of change that's taking place, it was for hundreds of years, organizations would pretty much stay the same. So the leaders would just pass the nobility or whatever the kingpins were. They were the owners economically. They were the owners and the overseers of the land, whoever owned the land. All of those things hadn't changed for centuries. And now, as we all know, it's fundamentally changing. So the definition of what it means to be effective as a leader can no longer be the same. And the people that are used to be kept out of leadership roles. One of the things that I like to point out is that there's really no such thing as a C-suite anymore. The C-suite is a artificial barrier that was created by the people at the top to make it seem like there's a very special group of folks that are sitting at the top of the organization, and the rest of them are employees. But that's becoming so much more permeable. There are organizations now that are being led from the bottom up. There are entrepreneurs that are creating environments where they're basically creating a team that's not hierarchical, that is trying to get the best out of everyone. So these are pretty fundamental changes, no question about it.
That's interesting. So I was thinking about what you're saying about the power that leadership holds. So I'm curious to understand. So when you're a leader, you work very closely with the culture of an organization, right? So either or you have a slightly more influence than maybe a guy or like on the totem pole on that, right? So now, from your vantage point, when you look at leadership, how much of culture is designed by a leader, or does a leader is picked by a culture? So like from when you mix the two, when you take an organization and this particular individual, which one should gravitate towards what? Like who is the sun and who is the planet in that conversation? Like I'm curious.
It's a great question. I think this is another one of those areas where the research is starting to give us some really good data and some good information about how cultures actually form. And the answer to your question is both. That the leaders do, whoever steps up as the founder or the creator or the leader of an organization does have a very strong influence on the culture. But I work with entrepreneurs. It's a great example. I just give you one real life example. I was working with a CEO who started a software company. After about 3 years, he had about 100 employees. And he said to me, Jeff, I think we should start thinking about the culture. I need to start focused on what kind of culture we have. And I said to him, well, it's about 2 years too late. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, because the culture forms the minute you have 3 people, 5 people. Culture is created by tribes. Tribes are formed as soon as people form groups. And the research now shows that human beings will create a culture even without a leader. The culture in that organization had already started being formed. So here's the thing. He thought that was bad news because I was telling him he was 2 years too late. But I said to him, it's actually good news because you're allowing your firm, your company to develop a culture, and now you need to figure out what it is, and then you need to influence it in ways that bring out the best in everyone. And so he was like, well, what do I do? And I said, well, one of the things you can do is you can start to investigate by having conversations with groups of your employees in different functions, and having them come together and ask questions. What are the values that we follow here? Why do you work here? What do you care about? What makes you want to come to work in the morning? What is great about working at this organization? And the CEO said to me, this is so much fun. I can listen and learn about my own company. And I said, yeah, and then you can influence. Because when you hear the bumps, when you hear the things that you'd like to see shift and change, then you can have an influential voice. So it's really, to your question, creating culture starts at the very day one of an organization. And it's a dance between the leaders and the people. They will do it together. But the more aware they are of what they're doing, the more likely they'll get the kind of culture that they want. So, you cannot wait too long, or it really can be too late.
Interesting. So, I think I was reading about a study, and I think there was a study on the impact of CHRO or impact of CEO on an organization. And they were sort of figuring out if had the decision been a coin toss compared to what they decided, like how much different that situation would have been, right? And they feared that a CEO's ability or decision making is coming very close to a coin toss scenario, right? So I think that's because we are living in the age of data. So now we can sort of create this nuanced approach and trying to figure out how much of an incentive is CEO getting by being on the top when his competency is similar to a coin toss at some point, right? So
Yeah.
when you look at leadership from say those decisions point of view, right? So I'm leading for my decisions that I'm influencing this organizations for, and then there's an argument that okay, if had there been a coin toss, probably we would have both done equal damage to the organization. So what I'm curious, like what's your take about, and that is speak to something about the science or the artist or the like being an artisan on the top. How do you comprehend that thought? I'm curious.
Well, it's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I have the magic answer, but I think you're absolutely right. I was also reading a recent research study of entrepreneurs, and I'm forgetting the university where they studied a group of entrepreneurs, and they separated them into two groups. And one group they set up to build their company using empirical data. So they used a science-driven format to build the company, to figure out the business model, to figure out the product, to figure out how to structure the company. And another group they used as a control group where they just let them have entrepreneurs figure out what they want and do it just like they normally do, right? And they studied them for 2 years. And how much difference do you think the scientifically driven company did compared to the other company?
I think that the data science in me says fared the same, similar.
I was actually about 10% better.
Okay, not
So there was evidence that the empirically scientific driven decision making process did have a positive influence. But it was nowhere near as much as what they were thinking. They were thinking that, this would be 30, 40, 50% better success rate, and it wasn't true. So, the reality is that I think science and understanding how culture works and how organizations come together as a tribe and how communities build and how teams perform is very valuable. But I think we underestimate the influence, or we overestimate actually the influence of individual leaders. And then the other thing that's interesting is that the studies have shown that it's not so much what the leaders say that is really influential by what they do. It's the nonverbal. So this is also connected to what I wrote about in my book, which is that you don't have to be a charismatic leader with what I call the alpha heroic personality. You can actually be very influential by being quieter, by having a different kind of framing, by being very mindful and present. People, studies of trust and the neuroscience of connection have shown that people will follow a leader who's quite quiet if they trust what that leader is saying. And so sometimes it's nowhere near as important for the person to be loud and charismatic. And this is now being demonstrated by the science of influence. So these things are all changing as we're working. And as I said, I don't have a magic formula, but it's fascinating to see the evolution because we're coming to know so much more about what leadership does and works than we have.
I think and thank you for shedding light on it because you're spot on. So why I ask you this question is so in sort of in our day. So today we live in the world of data and AI, right? So it's everywhere. We hear about that word a lot. And if you wear your statistician hat, you said yes, coin toss and CEO, coin toss wins because I don't have to pay anything to the coin toss. But then what you're saying when you wear your sort of organizational psychology hat, right? And you say, imagine an organization with no leader, right? So imagine the physiological or the mental changes that happens in an organization when you realize the topmost guy is just a coin toss, right? And that you cannot quantify with any research, right? Because that's the emotional, that's the well-being, that's the Maslow's hierarchy. that you're totally missing out on once you take the leader out of that equation, right? And
Right.
I think from that vantage point, I totally agree with you that having a leader, um, it has the non-verbal cues that are defining that organization is is probably doing a more impact than sort of those statistical anomaly or a statistical significance on the success or the failure of an organization.
Right. Yeah, they've studied engagement, and the research is beginning to show that people don't stay at a company because of the CEO unless they work directly with the CEO. And then the influence is very important. But once a company becomes, and I shared this with my client who is getting to be 100 people, 200 people, 300 people, they like to know what the CEO's vision is. They want to hear it. But the reason they stay with the company is because of the leader of their team, the leader of their close-knit community. And it's interesting because intuitively, if you step back and you think about it, human beings are tribal. So if your CEO is 3,000 miles away and he is not on video talking to you every other day, then the person you really care about is who is your day-to-day team. And do you trust them? Do you feel safe with them? Can you try out new ideas with them? Can you have an impact on them? And that's going to help you decide whether you stay with the company and whether the company is where you want to have a long-term relationship. And, a lot of the things that we used to think were key to success, like paying people more money, beyond a certain point, it's not anywhere near as influential. So it's
Interesting.
interesting.
And I'm curious to know your point of view on, so is a good led organization more like a king or an autocracy or in so let's take the negatives out. Let's just say there's a king, right? And so say there's a meritocracy that exists there. Or do you think it is a democratic system of lot of elected officials? When you think about a good led organization, do you know like which kind of model resonates better with a good led organization? I'm curious.
I mean, the way that I would answer that question is that there are strengths and weaknesses to both authoritative organizations, hierarchical organizations, and democratic participative organizations. The authoritative organization is very good in an emergency. Think about it. If you're flying a plane, you want the person in the pilot's seat to be authoritative.
Hmm.
If you're having surgery, you really hope that the surgeon is running the show,
Hmm.
right? You don't want him to be a Democrat.
Hmm.
Democratic.
Hmm.
You don't want him while your body's open to be saying, so should we do this? Why don't we vote on whether or not this person is going to, you don't want that. But on the other hand, if you're trying to run an organization to come up with creative ideas,
Hmm.
be innovative, which is what we need in today's world to solve all the huge issues, economic issues, social justice issues, environmental issues. If you're really trying to be creative, then you don't want a pyramid with just a few smart people at the top because you're not getting the talent from everyone. So a much more creative way of organizing would be a democratic or a consensus-driven organization where you encourage people to step up with their ideas because you really want to get the creativity from as many people as possible. So I think it really depends on the context. But I would summarize by saying that where we're headed and what I pointed to in my book is that the human race on planet Earth does not have the luxury of it anymore of just being top down.
Hmm.
We have to become more democratic because we really need to listen to the talent that we have in order to solve all the problems. So it's almost like it's flipped. It used to be that you could run an organization for hundreds of years with fairly simple group at the top, but that's not going to be sustainable. So now I think we have to, as organizations, as entrepreneurs, hopefully even as countries, we have to start to broaden out our acceptance of leadership from around the company, from around the group, not just from the top.
So if we see organizations today, right? So we even started to hear flattening of an organization again, decreasing the depth and making it more broader. So in that construct, how is leadership being changed, or leadership needs to evolve? I'm always curious. So if there's a chain of command, you know who to go. Like there's a chain of command, and its chain is well established. Whatever is going on in a flattening organization, many times it's slightly broad when it comes to um, so how are the leadership landscape change between these two templates of say IBMs of the world versus maybe now where Apple is heading to? It's still not there, but more sort of flattened and more sort of out. I'm curious,
Yeah,
what do you think?
it's a great question. I think the simplest way to understand the shift in energy is, and I do this with all of my clients that are very senior leaders, because they are in the middle of this that we're talking about, right? Is to step back and reflect on the distinction between power over others and power with. And being in a dynamic where you are empowering others to work with you in a partnership, in a collaborative dynamic, does not mean that you give up power. It's sharing power. It's supporting the empowerment of others. But if there's an emergency, or if there's a crisis, or there's a really difficult decision, you can still take back the power, or you can serve it up to the others and say, you know what? I think you're the most expert person on this subject, so I think you should have the power over the decision. But the core theme is really the awareness between the distinction of power over and power with. And the more that leaders, whether it's in an IBM or a startup or anywhere else, the more they become aware of that, then they can choose, because at the end of the day, it's really about a choice. What is the kind of power that's going to work most effectively in this situation? And then they can decide minute by minute. And I literally mean minute by minute. I mean, the other theme of my book is leadership agility. And agile leaders can do power over in the morning and power with in the afternoon. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be 3 months of power over and 2 months of power with. I mean, it can be minute to minute. And I have a case study in my book that I wrote about, which was one of the things that started me on that journey, was that I worked with a surgeon at a very prestigious hospital. And he was very power over at 7 o'clock in the morning because he was saving lives. But at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when he was leading a meeting with his colleagues, it's completely different energy.
Interesting. Wow.
He stood back, he handed off the power, and he was a collaborator, he was a listener. So it can be both.
I think
which is a really big step for a lot of leaders.
Yeah, well, I think this is fascinating. Like if you can flip, because I think sometimes it's very very hard to be that agile. I think you're actually spot on. So on that note, what do you think are some of the tenets of a good leader? Like so from your vantage point, this is a great example what you told. But if I want to be a great leader, like what are some of the tenets that I should start to evaluate in me? What do you think?
You start with having a reflection and hopefully getting some feedback from a coach or from a mentor or someone you trust about your strengths. It's really valuable at any point in your career to actually be able to articulate what you know you're good at. And so few people can do it. I ask my clients, so tell me, what are the top 3 things that you do really well? Well, I'm not sure. I don't know. People say that I do this. It's like, so number 1 is having awareness about your strength. And the reason that's so valuable is because those very same strengths are usually all liabilities. So your top 3 strengths are usually your top 3 weaknesses. So if you start by having that sense of awareness, then you can start to play the instrument of yourself as a leader and expand the repertoire. So, for example, I know I'm really good at being a great communicator. I have great stories. I have a great sense of humor. I keep people engaged. Okay, so that's great. That's a strength. When is that a liability? Oh, Jeff, it's never a liability. Oh, well, some of your colleagues seem to think you talk too much. You take up a lot of space. You tell too many jokes when they're trying to get work done. You try to influence everybody by telling stories when actually they want data. Hello, all of a sudden you just found out that the thing that you do really well is actually overused. So that's the kind of thing I would recommend anyone who's aspiring to be a leader, even at a very young age, even when you're in graduate school or you're just starting out in your career, start to pay attention. So the 2 things what your strengths are, what you're good at, and also what you love, which is kind of a cliche, but I think it's important to know your passion. What are you drawn to? Whenever I work with a client who has lost their passion, it happens during different times in your life, even if you're very successful. I've had them say to me, I don't really know, Jeff. I'm not sure what I'm passionate about anymore. It's a very simple way to find out. What do you read when you pick up the New York Times? Or the Boston Globe? Pick up a big newspaper or online on your iPad. What do you go to if you have no assignment? Oh, I go to the travel section. Oh, well, why do you read about the travel section? Oh, because I love to travel. Oh, you just told me you didn't know what you love. Oh, well, I go to the real estate section. Well, what about real estate? Oh, because I love architecture and I love seeing what's going on in the real estate market and I love the economics of it. Oh, so you have something you love. Oh, I read the sports section. Oh, really? Why? You see my point? I mean, we do know what we're passionate about. We just don't have it in our awareness all the time. So passion, values, strengths, those are the places I'd start.
I think so. You're raising a very interesting point, and I want to take a slight detour, and I want to talk about your perspective as a coach, right?
Right.
So leadership coach. So when I was a working me, and I left that job and started being an entrepreneur, being a leading me, right? So and one of the starkest revelation that I had was how much I was losing just running and not stopping and thinking what I'm doing, right? So as an employee, as a worker, you're too busy executing your day in and out. Like you want to crank, you want to crank some work, you want to see few managers happy, you are delivering, right? So that's your life's mission is make the upper leaders happy, so you exist.
Yeah.
But then when you stop and then now you're being on a leadership role, then the day I had a coach, the life transformed, and many of my colleagues felt the same way, right? They all had this aha moment of what, like, am I, just because of these tiny things I'm missing out on that freaking, right? And I could have been like, I could have been 10x better,
right?
And I think you raise a very interesting point, right? So not knowing about what excites us, what is passionate, what sort of we are passionate about. So I'm curious to know, as a leadership coach, right? And whenever I see a coach, I thank them for whatever they're doing and saving humanity and a lot of productivity from making the other guy hopefully see the reflection of what they are. But on the other side, I feel how much is there's a deficit of that kind of um, talent pool, right? So I wish when I was a worker, I had access to, say, a coach, or I had access to just some, you call it mentor, you call it coach, you call it like whatever you call it, who just not responsible for my productivity, who just look at me as me and help me navigate my happiness in my work. So when you see that landscape, like I'm curious to know, did you get a chance to think about how much we would be less dying of heart attack if we are slightly living while we're working, right? So it's not a huge leap. It just feel what you're anything you are raising a very interesting point. If you just know what you're passionate about and you just give tiny bit to that, now suddenly you're enjoying your work. It's not a work anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of my passions in life is to turn everyone I know into a leader and to turn everyone I know into a coach. And the reason it's both is because the best leaders
Hmm.
are those that are open to coaching, receive coaching, and get the benefit of coaching. And then they learn to do it themselves. They understand, they experience the value of coaching, and then they seek to become coaches themselves. And so if you create if you think about it, if you create an organization where coaching is one of the key attributes of the leaders, it's going to be a very powerful environment because people will feel drawn to trust and share with each other in ways that prompt everyone to grow. And that's what we need in this world, is for everyone to have that experience. I mean, we all know what it would be like. Many of us had a great teacher when we were in high school. We look back, or junior school, and we think, I had one teacher.
Hmm.
You know, when people ask me, who influenced you? I went back in my yearbook and I saw one person who wrote, I believe that you will have an amazing career. One day I will see your name at Harvard. That actually really happened. I was 13 years old and I thought, that's crazy. I'll never be at Harvard. I don't have anything that's going to I don't have any money. I'm not going to Harvard. Guess what? I am faculty at Harvard. And that teacher inspired me,
Hmm.
but he wasn't easy. He gave me tough feedback on my papers. It was like, I'm sure you had a couple of those, right?
Yes.
We look back and we think, gosh, I wish I had more of those. So we need more of that. That's my passion.
So, managers, I want to take a perspective on, from your leadership vantage point, what is the difference between a leader and a manager? I'm curious.
I think it's an unnecessary question. I think that there's a historically known narrative that distinguishes between leadership and management. So management is execution and controlling the outcome of activities and making sure that the people that are, handling different activities are doing their jobs and all of that. Um, and leadership is supposed to be some kind of broader narrative that's more strategic and visionary and sort of sets the tone for the organization, maybe a little bit more distant from the day to day. But I personally think that's a lot of BS. Um, I think those are all false dichotomies. I think management is something that good leaders do when they need to do it. And leadership is what the best managers learn to do. And so I think we've, as a culture in the West in particular, I think we wasted a lot of time with these kind of false
Hmm.
narratives. Like, are you a manager or are you a leader? Like, who cares? What you need to be is creating an environment where everyone lives out their full potential as a human being in the environment where you have influence. If you want to call it management, it's management. If you want to call it leadership, it's leadership. The distinction that you're asking about, and it's a very valid question.
Hmm.
So I don't mean to be dismissive,
Hmm.
but the question itself evolved out of an industrial age mindset. Frederick Taylor, back in the early 20th century, created structures when Henry Ford, built cars. that needed something called industrial psychology and management science. But when you think about what they were trying to do, is they were trying to reduce human beings to machines. And 100 years later, which is almost exactly, it's probably about 100 years exactly, we are doing exactly the opposite. We already have all the machines we need. And what we need to do is to stop seeing human beings as machines. Because we have AI, we have robots, we have all that, and they become more accessible all the time. So we can automate just about anything. What is left for humans then to be is creative, artistic, solving problems, creating a world. So I'm not really interested in the distinction between leadership and management. I think that the whole thing kind of came out of a different time. We don't live in that time anymore. So I'm not sure if you like that answer.
No, I think it makes sense. It definitely makes sense. And so when you're leading an organization and when you bring in people, I think as a leader you pick a lot of, and you're right in saying that a lot of BS about you don't want to be a manager, you want to be a leader. And many times that distinction was, so if you are a manager, or if you are so-called called manager in an organization, you always try to sort of either be belittle about your effort and saying no, you should be managing, you should be leading, not managing. And
Right.
sometimes it gets very, very hazy, as you rightly said, that it's very difficult to distinct, are you a manager or are you a leader, or how to distinct between the two. So I think
to me, it's artificial.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it in my example of a surgeon. When the surgeon is doing surgery, and I watched, he's very much in execution mode. Hand me the scalpel, and so it's very tactical. So that would be management, right? He's not sitting up above watching, going, you do this and you do this and you do this. No, he's right in there doing it. And it's like saying that the architect is above the construction people. Now, on one level, the architect might have the plans, might have the bigger picture, but I don't know if you've ever worked with an architect, but every architect I've ever worked with, they love to get their hands dirty.
Yeah.
They're in there bugging. They're like, the plumbing goes this way and I bought it this way and I don't want it like that way. And the construction guy is like, get out. You're supposed to be the architect. And then my construction workers one of them renovated my house. He came up with this beautiful design. I'm like thinking to myself, oh, you're just a contractor. And he's like, but I'm an artist. That's what makes him a great contractor, is because he's more than a contractor. He's an artist. So the distinction is really a false distinction. And the best leaders manage and the best managers lead.
I think that's beautifully put, and thank you for enlightening on that. So from your vantage point, what are some of the misconceptions when it comes to leadership today? So when someone comes to you, what are some of the misconceptions that you find that people have about leadership? I'm curious.
Oh yeah. Well, number one, I already mentioned that you have to be charismatic. I don't find that to be true at all. There's no science that demonstrates that. Number two, that you have to be more senior, that you have to be more experienced. Yes, it can help, but it's not required. I was working with the CEO of this startup for a couple of years, and he, as I said, wanted to build the culture of the organization. I encouraged him to have engagement conversations, as we discussed. And he asked me, who should I have facilitate those discussions, cross-functional discussions of values? And I said, because he thought it should be only the senior people. And I said, well, why don't you send an email to the whole company and ask who's interested? See what happens. 24-year-old woman from Venezuela, beautiful, young, brilliant Latina, wrote to him and said, I love this idea. This is something that I've always thought we should do, is build the culture from the ground up. And I love this company. Can I help facilitate? And he was like, Jeff, should I let this 24-year-old woman facilitate conversations? Well, you know the punchline. She was excellent at it. She's now running the engagement process for this whole company that now has 300 people. So, that's another myth, that you have to have a certain amount of experience or be a certain age. That doesn't mean that every single 22-year-old, I'm managing one right now, actually, they don't all want to be, they're not all capable of running the company, but they shouldn't be dismissed. They should be listened to and they should be nurtured. So those are some of the myths, I would say. And there's a long list. I could probably go on for a long time, but that's
I think, yes. So thank you for walking us through that. So now let's spend a few minutes on the book. Okay. So definitely love the book. And I think what I particularly like about the book is how you laid out compartmentalized leadership from like mental, and sort of you talk about emotional, and then you talk about semantics of being a leader. Right. Walk us through the process of how do you see leadership? I think when I was reading this book, it was interesting that how you laid it out and say, okay, this is, so walk us through your journey about writing this book and how do you,
Well, I think basically the summary from the framework came from research that I did with about 1,200 coaches. So a lot of coaches that I had discussions with, focus groups, interviews, so that I could find out what are the coaches being asked to work on with the leaders of today. And it came out in certain categories: decision-making, communication, collaboration, being authentic, creating an engaged environment. So those turned out to be the different domains based on the research of what folks were working on. Emotional intelligence, for example. And then I recognized in my own practice that there are 3 fundamental components to all of those activities. There's the cerebral, there's the thinking process that you go through in decision-making, communicating, all of those, collaborating. Then there's the emotional context, because human beings don't do anything that doesn't have an emotional underpinning. If you think about trust and you think about safety and you think about communicating, there's always an emotion. It's in your eyes, it's in your face, it's in your sense of wellness, right? So there's an emotional component. And then the physical presence is something that very few people have really written a lot about, but what I call the somatic energies of a leader. How you sit, how you use your hands. Even now on video, this is important, like how we're present. Those things are actually really important in terms of creating the kind of environment for engagement and for collaboration. So that's why I came up with those categories and the 3 domains: cerebral, emotional, and somatic. And then, as you know in the book, there's case studies for basically how to think about your style as a leader. Are you kind of what I call the alpha, sort of the rational, driven, fact-driven, decisive kind of leader, which is more traditional? Or are you more flexible, more democratic, more consensus, more of a curious, listening kind of leader? And then everything in between. And the fundamental theme of my book is the goal, as we mentioned earlier, is you need to develop your agility to be able to do it all. And it's a lifelong journey. So you find out where you start and then you look to expand. And that's ultimately how I framed and that's why the book is called Flex, because at the end of the day, that's what we need, right? Is to develop agile, flexible leaderships.
So when you're writing this book, and I'm curious to learn from you, who should think about leadership? Like, number one, so who is this book for? And number 2, in an organization, when is the time to think about improving your leadership jobs? I'm curious, like from your vantage.
I mean, I think the book can be useful as a tool for just about anyone that's at a certain level of either in a very important leadership role. The book will help you think about how a coach, for example, would work with you to expand your repertoire. If you're in what I would call the next generation leaders, this book is designed to accelerate the process for you so that you could step up faster. And it's like having a coach, right? Where you can excel because that's what coaching gives you. And then finally, I mean, I think if you're at a more junior level or if you're still a student, because I know some of my colleagues are using this book in their management classes or their leadership business classes, I would say it's to help the students start to reflect on, do they want to be a leader? And if so, what do they need to develop? It's like a fitness instructor for leadership. What do you need to work on? What muscles do you need to work on? If you're already a great communicator, how could you even be better? So
I think that's so. Whenever I see books on leadership, I think one thing that I find really fascinating is, so we had this lot of internal debate in even my organization when it comes to what it means to be a leader, and many times sort of I have used that word saying that leadership is a tool, right? So don't think of it as that this, you want to be a leader. It's something that, so if we understand the chemistry of brain, right, we all share the same chemistry. The ingredients are almost the same, and if
right,
you are younger, you have probably the better mechanics working and the better chemistry working than the older guy or the more seasoned guy, right? So they have their biases, they have a lot of other nuances going on. so
right,
so you always sort of see that maybe if we give these books to a guy or gal early on in their career, saying, okay, read this or read some of these content, and just keep it in mind, as and I think you rightly pointed out that they will it's like a muscle, right? So you don't know when you will need it, but it's good to know that you are working on that muscle. So
right.
sometime if the time comes, and maybe again we have the same ingredients that probably will lead us to the same solution. So I'm curious, like what's your thought?
Well, yeah, I totally agree with everything you're saying. And I would say that the other thing that's really fundamentally important to me in writing the book and in disseminating the information is that until the last decade or so, there have been a lot of people on the planet who would never think of themselves as possibly being a leader, and they might never have the opportunity. And that's changing.
Mm.
And then if they had thought about being a leader, they would think they had to do it in the way that all of the white guys that have been doing it for the last 2,000 years do it. And that's also changing. So, it's one of my passions to expand the horizons of what's possible for this multicultural, multinational world that we live in, so that people who have never thought of themselves as being potentially stepping into leadership will not only consider it a possibility, but actually really do it, really step up. And, I think that is what we're seeing happening, and they're finding ways to lead that are not necessarily by following the old model. They can create their own model. And that's why I wanted to be very flexible in my approach to leadership. And I also don't really denigrate the more traditional authoritative leaderships. I had a group of senior executives at a bank recently that I was talking about the book. And at one point, one of the older white guys raised his hand and he said, "So do you want me to just jump out the window, Jeff?" And I said, "Please don't. We're on the 60th floor of a building. This was pre-pandemic." I said, "I think that's probably not a good idea." And he said, "Well, what is my role then if you don't really want to have these old white guys running the planet anymore?" And I said, "I love that question because there's so much wisdom, there's so much knowledge, there's so much talent that you can bring to the next generation. But just have your eyes and ears open that they don't have to lead the way you did it. They can learn from you, but you can learn from each other." And there's a difference between mentoring someone to become like you. That's more like paternal, like dad and son, or what, dad and child, right? But you can be a partner and be a mentor. So he was much happier. He didn't jump out the window. I said, "No, there's a lot of value in, but the world is changing, and he knows it. And I personally think that's a good thing."
No, that's pretty fascinating. So, by the way, so thank you so much on helping us understand leadership. I can go on and on this. I think it's pretty fascinating, and So let's work on let's go on a next segment of on our
Okay.
conversation. So we call it rapid fire, and
Okay.
the idea behind it. So I'll usher out a word or a small sentence, and then whatever comes to your mind, a word or sentence, just and then just let us know. And if you want to take a deeper dive, be at it. But the idea is just whatever comes to your mind, be snappy.
Okay.
Awesome. So let's do that. So startups.
Um, the future. They are that's where the creativity starts.
Entrepreneurship.
Everyone. That's the kind of world I want to create, is where I want everyone to be an entrepreneur.
Failures.
So what was it?
Failures.
Oh, failures. Necessary learning steps along the way.
Growth.
The lifelong journey of living out our full potential.
Culture.
Sorry?
Culture.
Oh, culture. Uh, it's what ties us all together as a human tribe.
Leadership.
It's what we do when we get out of bed in the morning. We lead our day. Everyone is a leader. We just have to own it, grow it, expand it, nurture it, and use it in ways that solve the big problems of our planet.
I think that's the most it's the most interesting and innovative definition of leadership I've heard. But I hope it's true. Many days I feel it's a beautiful effort. uh, Disruption.
Inevitable. It's what we live in. It's what we're going to continue to live in. And we need to learn to be agile to address it, to respond.
Skill of the future.
What of the future?
A skill of the future.
Skill of the future. What came to my mind is the word interconnectivity. And by that, I mean really learning how to read each other effectively, like really a different depth of knowing each other. It's going to be an important skill.
Future of organizations.
Uh, Unclear, unknown. I think that business models are going to be transformed amazing ways over the next couple of decades. And I'm not sure that many organizations are ready for it.
uh, Future of leadership.
Future of leadership is bright as long as we focus on self-awareness as a
So so
core.
so you strongly believe they will not be replaced by a coin toss.
No, not anytime soon.
Awesome. So thank you so much for playing with rapid fire with us. So
Sure.
now let's spend few minutes on your personal journey. So we ask all of our guests to share some of the qualities that has shaped them become what they have become. What are some of the qualities that you attribute your success to? I'm curious.
Well, I think you mentioned one of them. I mean, I would start by saying curiosity, because I was one of those kids who couldn't decide what to major in college because I wanted to major in everything. I loved every single subject except economics because I couldn't quite get it, but I think I would love it today. But I love science. I love math. I love music. I wound up being a philosophy and music major because I couldn't figure out. So curiosity has definitely part of been my journey. But then some failures along the way. And I think that uh, that's been a benefit because it's made me more humble. And that's another quality that we didn't talk about a lot today, but I think it's a really important quality for anyone who aspires to be a leader, is to find out where your arrogance lies and where your narcissism is, because we all have a dose of it from childhood probably and from our family. But, you know, perfectionism and arrogance will get us all killed. So yeah, I think that I look back on my failures. I can give you one quick example. I was about 23 years old when I was hired at a very prestigious software company, and I had my first secretary. And I was really right out of college. And I told her she had to go do the X, Y, and get coffee and make copies and do all this. And after about 2 weeks, my boss came to me and he said, Jeff, your secretary is not a dog. They are a human being. And I said, oh, but that's what they're for, right? He's like, no, you can make copies. You can get your own coffee. We're not living in 1940. I was like, that was a big wake up call. So, you know, and there's been a few other failures along the way, but I think that those are important steps. You know, when things don't go well, turning them into a learning journey for me has been important.
I think that's pretty interesting because I totally agree with you, because failures are something that as a leaders many times you're not incentivized to share, like even not even accepting your failures, but even showing that you're vulnerable, showing that you had fails, and showing your scars in public. Like, many times you just it it's frowned upon when it comes to sort of, and actually leaders have a lot more scars to show. They have more scars than the success, so they can actually educate people that it's human to be like whatever, right? So I totally agree with you. I think I wish, and maybe when you said it's about being masculine and feminine, maybe it has to do something with that, like making sort of more, instead of saying no, I have to be this sort of this alpha or whatever that's called, instead of being more agile and saying okay, no, I'm a human. There are things that I think it's a pretty. I wish there would world would be a lot more responsive to failures, like, and not panic out then when leaders are failing. No, everything is failing. So it's pretty
I
interesting.
agree. I mean, it's hard because it's painful, you know? I mean, it's a sense of shame, and you obviously, if you're a very highly achieving person and all of a sudden you don't do well or something doesn't go well, it's not easy to sit with. So, but over time, you can reflect and learn and look back and realize, oh, you know what? That was probably the best thing that ever happened to me.
Yeah,
And
absolutely, yeah.
so those are important components of my
Awesome.
journey.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So, what are some of the favorite reads that have influenced you, or you're reading right now? Whatever you can share besides Flex.
Yeah, I don't read Flex, although I do occasionally need to look back on it.
You lived Flex, so yeah.
Exactly. I I'm loving two or three things that I've been reading. I tend to read a lot of things at once, but there's a wonderful book called The Listening Society by an author named Hansi Freinacht, and it's really a wonderful journey on the development of society. And he weaves psychological development with societal development, so it's like a systemic view. And it's pretty intense reading, but it's also about what the world needs to do in order to overcome a lot of these challenges that we face. So I like that. It's called The Listening Society. Another book that's written along the same lines. I love anything written by Charles Eisenstein. He's written some pretty amazing reflections on the economic system, on the health of society. And then my other new favorite is a woman named Nora Bateson, who is the daughter of Gregory Bateson, the famous philosopher. And she writes about something called warm data. And I'm forgetting the name of her book, but just look up Nora Bateson. What's fascinating about her is that she writes about the challenge of being too focused on a data-driven world. That there is a real obstacle to our addiction to what we call empiricism or data science or objectivity. And so she's offering up what she calls warm data, which is a wonderful phrase, because basically what she's saying is you need to blend data and systems and science with intuition and art and poetry. And then the context feels broader. And when the context feels broader, then the solutions to problems emerge from that. It's a really interesting writer. She's a great writer.
Oh, pretty awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Now, last but not the least, so if you want our listeners and viewers to take away something from this conversation, what would that be? So what would be a parting thought to our listeners and viewers?
Well, I think the fundamental theme of my work in the world is to do what I can to help us solve our biggest problems, which are political, economic, social justice, ecological. There's so many challenges. And I really believe that we need everyone to see themselves as a leader in solving those problems. And so that's the parting thought that I leave with everyone I talk to, which is, if you've ever thought that you did not want to be a leader, banish that thought. You do, because you may not want to run a company, you may not want to be a CEO, but you want to make a difference in the world, and that's leadership.
With that, Jeff, thank you so much for being gracious with your time, helping us understand the state of leadership. And to our listeners and viewers, like, I had prepared a bunch of questions that I want to ask. I actually touched upon almost nothing. So it was fascinating conversation. And Jeff, thank you so much for being patient with me and helping understand the nuanced world of leadership and giving it a very interesting, and I do appreciate your work and thank you, and you're always welcome back on the podcast. Wish you success on the book. Thank you so much on that.
Thank you for having me. It was great fun. Great conversation.
I was homesick, never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick.